The following podcast is non-profit and is based on the IGCSE history curriculum. Welcome to Series 5 of my history podcast, From One Student to Another. In this episode, we will be looking at the Korean War, which took place between June 25th, 1950 and July 27th, 1953. Let's start with the background. In 1949, China became communist after a long civil war. Support for the communists had increased due to corruption, high taxes, food shortages, and a desire for land. Mao Zedong had led the communists to defeat the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, who had been backed by American financial aid. American spies had also informed President Truman that Stalin was using Cominform to help communists in Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, the Philippines, and Korea to take control. The government was very anxious as the USSR had recently successfully tested an atomic bomb. The US feared that the Soviets wished to take over the entire continent of Asia. Let's start to introduce the Korean crisis. Until 1945, the Japanese Empire ruled over the Korean peninsula, but at the end of World War II, the north of Korea was liberated by the Red Army, while the south was liberated by the US Army. The Soviets helped Kim Il-sung's communist government to take control of the north, while the US supported Syngman Rhee's anti-communist government. Although the government was very corrupt and undemocratic, the US supported it due to its anti-communism. Korea became divided at the 38th parallel, and both leaders were very hostile towards each other. North Korea used a surprise attack and invaded South Korea, which overwhelmed their army. By September of 1950, the South Korean army had been pushed back to Busan, a small area on the southern tip of Korea. So, why would Truman want to get involved? Firstly, he's very anti-communist and wants to contain it, and secondly, there is open warfare, and he wants to prevent another war. Now, what problems arose, and how did the US react? Firstly, North Korean forces invaded South Korea and conquered all but the Busan area of South Korea. The US responded by taking the issue to the UN Security Council. At this time, the USSR couldn't veto any actions as they were boycotting the United Nations, and as a result, the UN sent forces, mainly US troops, to Korea. Secondly, the UN Army was led by General MacArthur, a World War II veteran who planned a counterattack to push out the North Koreans with land defense and an amphibious assault behind enemy lines. Truman backed MacArthur's plan, and it was successful. The UN forces were able to take control of the South Korean capital within 4 days and had reached the border by October the 1st. By the 1st of October, UN soldiers had reached the 38th parallel. Truman had to decide whether to invade North Korea or stop at the border. However, this could result in Chinese intervention. MacArthur persuaded Truman to order the troops to advance, and by October the 7th, the troops had reached the Yalu River near the Chinese border, deep inside North Korea. China then warned that they would enter the war if the UN soldiers continued to advance. However, the US ignored their warning, and China crossed the Yalu River. UN forces were forced to retreat while French and British leaders asked for the US to negotiate a peace settlement to end the war. MacArthur planned a new counterattack, which failed, and North Korea took over Seoul and regained North and much of South Korea. General MacArthur continued to ask for further action, while British Prime Minister Clement Attlee was persuading Truman to end the war. Again, Truman agreed with MacArthur's counterattack, and this time it was a success, pushing North Korean and Chinese forces back to the 38th parallel. Now, Truman had begun to agree that a peace settlement was necessary. MacArthur wanted to continue fighting and criticized Truman and the idea of a peace settlement with China. As he was ignoring Truman's orders, he was dismissed by Truman. Peace settlements were negotiated and the war ended. To this day, North Korea still claims that it won the war. To sum it all up, how successful was the US in Korea? On the one hand, failures included 1. The war had shown that the US was not invincible. Chinese and North Korean forces had been able to inflict several defeats and many casualties on the UN army. 2. the USSR had realized that it should never boycott the UN Security Council again, as it was clear that the power of veto was important in blocking US attempts to stop the spread of communism. 3. The US policy of rollback had been a failure and was criticized by many of America's allies. On the other hand, successes included: 1. The war led to the creation of SEATO, the Southeast Asian equivalent of NATO, an anti-communist military alliance. 2. The US had prevented South Korea from becoming communist, and it became an important anti-communist ally in Asia. 3. The war had shown America's commitment to containing communism in Asia, which was a warning to other communist rebels. Thank you for listening to this episode of my podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast to be notified when I upload my next episode next week. Thank you for listening, and thank you for 1,000 total listens on my podcast, which we recently hit.